Hi, my name is Soumya and I'm a writing tutor at CWC, and today I'm going to be talking to you about some of my favorite books. So I have Sally Rooney to begin with, and I understand that might not be a very unconventional choice, but I love the way that the public meets the private in Sally Rooney's books. And I think if you're just beginning with her work, I would recommend beginning with either Normal People or Conversations with Friends. And these are the more traditional novels, I would say. Because they follow a very digestible narrative, but they're very deliciously incomplete in that these stories never have a very tangible sort of resolution, but they permeate into our lives. So that incompleteness doesn't bug you necessarily. And I think very sort of accessible narratives, holding very profound questions within them. That's something that Sally Rooney does really well. And I saw someone describe her books as smart people beach reads, and I think that's just a lovely genre. So I think that's something you can go with. And then if you want to delve deeper into the sort of moral conflicts that we have spoken about that Sally Rooney discusses in all of her works, I would say Beautiful World, Where Are You would also be a good choice. This is a bit of a polarizing book. I know I heard someone say that this feels like a long philosophical essay, but I would say that it's much more personal than that. The fact that this book is mostly written in the form of emails between two friends who occupy very different spaces in society and are still bound by certain memories, bound by a certain warmth that evades all of those divisions. I think that's been done really well. And this very repetitive conflict of trying to preserve one's own happiness by seeking the instant gratification of joy, of friendship, of sort of even financial stability, while occupying an extremely capitalist world. That back and forth, that conflict that we also probably imbibe in our lives, comes across really well, and it doesn't appear overbearing. It appears much more reflective, and it appears much more palatable in these books. And if you aren't sure that Sally Rooney is quite your thing, then I would say you can begin with one of her short stories. And we have Mr. Salary here, which is a pretty good short story, has that entire lovely incompleteness woven into it, and just very personal narratives that don't seek to alienate themselves from the public that they're surrounded by. So I think that's something beautiful about it. And on theme with books that remind me of these themes of loneliness, of friendship, I would say there is a certain alienation that I look for when I'm reading in terms of the subject matter of the books that I go for. And a lot of them are centered around big cities. So you can't talk about loneliness in a big city without talking about the lonely city. Absolutely beautiful. I remember this one quote from it that says, being lonely in a big city is like starving when people around you are feasting. And I think it's full of these very, very poignant reflections on the world. It also makes art history quite accessible. So taking down these almost creative pieces that have been given that very elite value, and connecting it to the universal experience of loneliness is something that this book does really well. And it is, I think, the first book that I read during the pandemic, which definitely made a big impact on me. Very quotable book, very, very poignant book. All right, I think since I then, after the pandemic, moved to New York City, that's the book that's another subject matter that my mind goes to next. So we have My Year of Rest and Relaxation. If you like witty, absurdist narratives, especially with quirky protagonists, this will definitely be your thing. And if you've ever had this urge to kind of just unplug from society for a good part of a year and then just wake up feeling refreshed and a functional part of it, and happy and nicer, that's basically what the protagonist here attempts to do. And we're not supposed to like the protagonist. She's privileged, she's selfish, she's overbearing and all of those things, but we are completely intrigued and completely interested in her story, and that's what matters. So the narrative, the sort of dazeful episodes she has as she wades in and out of consciousness when she's trying to sleep through an entire year and wake up a better person. It really makes it a very sort of absorbing read, and I think that's something pretty cool about it, and especially weaving it within a city like New York, where alienation is just a definitional aspect of it. I think that's something that works quite well for it. But we do need to redeem our cities, and as someone who's grown up in Delhi, I wanted to include one of the books that is set there, and we have A City Happens in Love, or the original title being Ishq Be Sheher Hona. This is by Ravish Kumar, translated to English by Akhil Katyal. It has some beautiful illustrations as well. And what this book does really well is it doesn't turn its back to the terrifying nature of the city that it talks about, but it also puts the lens onto very warm pockets of it. It has a loving gaze that isn't completely ignorant of the dangers that the city also kind of hosts. So I think just having that perspective to the city, it redeems it a bit, but it also gives you a look into the possibilities that the city offers, and the anonymity that is to be accessed at times in a loving manner. I think the next one, it would be amiss to not mention Mrs. Dalloway, and of course I had quite a few thoughts when I was reading this, which was during my undergrad. The fact that London becomes a character onto itself in this book, that Mrs. Dalloway is of course one of the characters, but you can't really tell when the narrative is fully transferred onto another character. The continuous nature of the narrative, how it flits between multiple people who may not be aware of each other and are quite separated in terms of social terms, but are also united by a shared sense of grief, a shared sense of loneliness. That's something that this book does really well, and it really shatters all the debate about the apparently separate nature of content and form. And I think this is when the form really carries the content and defines it and is inseparable from it. One thing that I read recently was Boulder. If you like somewhat of a quirky and headstrong protagonist in slightly absurd narratives, I think this is something that does it really well. Also very distinct form. It doesn't have any dialogue. We see all these rage-filled rants almost result in meaningful commentary on motherhood, on sexuality, on relationships, on living in a city that isn't quite your own, and that is what Boulder does quite well. It's a book that I wouldn't have normally read, but I just went into it without knowing anything about the story, and I'm so glad I did. I never thought that the abundance of nautical puns would actually make me so interested in it also. I think to go with that theme, definitely go with the flow here, let it sort of carry you, and take its brilliantness, the way it narrates it, which is in breathless sentences, and absolutely unique sort of a narrative there. Talking about that in-betweenness, or being in a city that you don't fully think you belong to, I also have some books about sort of in-betweenness, and of course starting with some of the diasporic books that I have Jhumpa Lahiri for. And if you haven't read Jhumpa Lahiri yet, I would say begin with Interpreter of Maladies. It's an anthology. You will get a good taste of the kind of fragrant yet very palatable writing that there is. It's very approachable writing while also being very breezy in a way. So I think that's something. But if you have an idea of how Jhumpa Lahiri writes, you could also check out In Other Words or Whereabouts, which are more recent works, and I don't have my copy of Whereabouts with me right now. But In Other Words works really well for me because even though I'm not particularly interested in linguistics as much, just the dedication that Jhumpa Lahiri in this book talks about to learning Italian, to immersing herself in everything surrounding that language so she can really own it. It speaks to this human urge to grasp onto and define your own identity. and not let others kind of define it for you or assign you certain names and identities, but rather consciously choose part of your identity, that identity that you would like to learn and claim as your own. And that is something that works really well. And I think these are also great airplane reads, because it's just very flowy language. It's flowy without being showy, which is pretty good, and a very fine balance to strike, of course. Another undergrad recommendation that I have actually is The Shadow Lines. And when you talk about in-betweenness, you have to talk about the poignant liminal space that is this book. I remember in lectures we would all be quiet and there'd be so many extra classes for this because we just wanted to read the entire book together, all of us in the class. And there must be so much space between the lines here because it sure accommodates a lot of meaning making. And it accommodates a lot of meaning making not in a sense that it's looking down upon you for not accessing certain hierarchies of literature, but because it really encourages you to make your own sense of what is happening in the book to a very great extent. And this is a book that is an experience into itself. When you talk about how it flits between regions, between chronologies, between people, between relations, I think it works really well. And I think this also goes really well if you're reading it right after Mrs. Dalloway. It takes that complicated narrative one step forward, but you have to let yourself be carried by this narrative and let yourself be immersed in it, and it will just be a whole new journey, and using quite accessible, I would say, language to kind of get into this complicated trajectory of narratives within it. It works really well, and I think this would probably be one of the hardest books to make an adaptation out of, and we talk about adaptations a lot with books because I'm just really interested in film. So even thinking about like a conversations with friends or a normal people which have had adaptations made out already, I think a good job that they do is containing the tone of the book, where these adaptations specifically really value the lulls and the silences and the mundanities that Sally Rooney's writing also has. And I think The Shadow Lines would prove really good material for an adaptation, but it would be so difficult to make one out of it. To flit between the narratives and to really capture that complicated in-betweenness without oversimplifying it for the viewers, and yet making it palatable enough for them to access some sort of meaning and use their active meaning making senses there. I think I would really like someone to try and make an adaptation out of it. That's just it has a very cinematic quality without being too easy to just translate onto the screen. We also have Ice Candy Man, and this is a narrative about partition from the eyes of a young Parsi girl. And of course, then the questions of in-betweenness are brought through as we see that the girl ages as the turbulent world around her gets worse and worse. And that's sort of the surroundings that make her growing process precarious as well. And you see that sort of evolution throughout the narrative. So I think this is also one that I recommend. And then I have two more books, and these are more film study specific books. And I think especially if you're interested in any sort of film history, these are the two bonus books that I wanted to talk about. First, we have Bombay Hustles, Making Movies in a Colonial City, and this is by Devashri Mukherjee, and I was very fortunate to have Professor Mukherjee as my thesis advisor in my master's. And this book, if you are interested in film, if you're interested in history, if you're interested in film history, if you're interested in just sort of seeing how a city develops around the camera and how the camera then represents those developments as well, I think that's something that you can definitely gain a lot of context for in this. And the fact that this doesn't appear as a textbook at all, because not only is the narrative very, very well written, but it also is written from the lens of gender, from the lens of labor, and everything from how the cotton crops kind of have a very direct relation to the Bombay film industry, to then shifting the gaze onto the cine workers, about how the industry absorbed and deflected some of the gender bias, and we also have some champions like Shanta Apte who worked within that space as well. And I think it really sheds light onto a lot of these stories that make up this industry, and very poignant, especially if you're interested in the state of Indian film industries right now. And then lastly, we have Censorium by William Mazzarella. And the one thing that this book does really well, I feel, is talk about censorship not just in the limited terms of what is not being allowed to be made or disseminated, but just how it is just as much about what is being made and what is being disseminated, and how the particular content that is being put out is furthering a kind of ideology, and who can access the alternate as well. And this features interactions with opinions of multiple media personalities that we would know about. I think it's quite relevant in today's time. So yeah, I think this is a book that I would definitely recommend checking out if you're interested in questions of censorship. And yes, those were the books that I wanted to share with you all. I hope that you found something that ignited your interest. I would say please stay tuned to this space, and we'll have many more people share their favorite books, so you can find something that is suitable for and of interest to you as well. Yeah, thank you so much.